It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. It's time for The Verdict.
Hello again and welcome to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett. My co-host is Kent Myers. Kent is one of Oklahoma's top legal experts. And this week, Kent, we're going to discuss the elections of last week.
Well, thankfully, the elections are over. I think a lot of Oklahomans, as well as people around the country, were really getting tired of the continuous nonstop campaigning, but they are over with decisive results. And we've entitled our show 2004 Election, What Happened and Why? And we've got Chris Wilson with us, who will discuss kind of some things that were surprising to him, some results that perhaps he had not expected, and some things that he did expect. We're going to talk about the presidential race, the Senate race, and some local elections. And what can we expect starting up pretty soon for the future?
What does the future hold? And what happened last week on all those elections? Chris Wilson next on The Verdict. Back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett, Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce our guest.
We are very pleased today to have Chris Wilson, the Chief Executive Officer of Wilson Research Strategy since 1998, joining us. Chris is a native Oklahoman, grew up in Lawton, now lives in the Washington, D.C. area in Virginia. He's a graduate of the University of Oklahoma and Georgetown University. He's an experienced person in polling, in political strategies, in business strategies, and does an awful lot of work advising not only campaigns but also corporate businesses as well. He has followed closely, of course, the races both nationally and locally during this last recent election period. And I might point out that Chris was the executive director of the Republican Party in Texas for several years, while George W. Bush was governor of Texas, and when the state Senate, I think it was the Democrats lost control of the state Senate, the Republicans assumed control. This is Chris's first visit on The Verdict, and we're really pleased you join us.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, Chris, let's talk about the presidential race first. What jumps out at you in the end?
I think the margin. Everybody went into it saying it was going to be a close race. I believed it was going to be a close race. And the fact is that Bush received more votes than Ronald Reagan received in 1984 in what was considered one of the greatest landslides of all time. Now, there was higher turnout, so let me give that disclosure. I think it's also it's the fact that he did receive a mandate. This is the first time since his father in 1988 received a majority of the votes. Clinton didn't do it. It hasn't happened, so he didn't do it the first time. This is the first time that's happened. Someone has gotten more than 50%. So he does go in with the mandate. And the final thing, and the thing that I think was surprising and somewhat distressing to me, was the exit polling. The exit polling was way off. We've heard a lot of talking about that.
What happened?
It's still up for grabs, and there are a lot of people who are doing a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of head-scratching to try and figure out why they did go wrong. I've heard theories from women were oversampled, to seniors were oversampled, to states were looked at wrong. I don't know is the answer. I know I did receive the exit polls because I have a relationship, as you know, Mick, with NBC, and from that I received them about 2 o'clock. And I was pretty distressed. Bush was down, as a Republican, Bush was down in every single swing state, including Florida. He was down in Ohio. He was down everywhere. And I was convinced it was going to be a really long night. And, of course, that didn't happen. Bush won most of the states where I heard that he was down in whenever these exit polls came out. And I really don't know. I know Dick Morris is putting forth a theory that the networks put this information out to try and taint the election. I'll be honest, I don't believe that. I don't think people who do what I do for a living, let me just be candid, all we have is our reputation, our integrity with the numbers. And when you put out numbers that are wrong, I mean, just by statistics, 1 in every 20 surveys are going to be wrong, and it's something people understand in this business, but you don't get every state wrong. And I think that there is probably a mixture of things that went into it, but I think it's really just that exit polling is, I think there's some people that are less likely to respond in person, because exit polling is all done in person, than are likely to do so over the phone. Because let's face it, the spirit of anonymity is gone, and a lot of people don't want to say who they voted for.
Let me change the subject to the Carson-Coburn race, the Senate race here in Oklahoma. First of all, were you surprised either at the outcome or the extent of the difference between the two?
I wasn't. Unfortunately, I've got enough people who can attest to the fact that our numbers had Coburn up 9 points going into the election. That's exactly what he won by. Just the Tuesday beforehand, the numbers that were released that are done the previous weekend on Channel 9 had him up 5 points. So he was able to increase that lead, and we released our numbers on Saturday, and again, it was a 9-point difference. This was a race that was, I would say, Brad Carson ran the perfect race until about 2 weeks out. And I think at that point, his ads got just a little bit too over the top negative, and I think it hurt him. I think there were some other things that happened that really kind of defined the race differently than the two candidates themselves that were defining it. And I also believe that it is very difficult in the state of Oklahoma for a Democrat to get above, at the top of the ticket, above a certain margin. Probably 43, 44% is about where that max out level is. So unless you have a strong independent, it makes it very difficult for a top of the ticket Democrat to win. So I would say no, I wasn't surprised, but at the same time, I think it was a surprising result to a lot of people.
Brad Carson was on our show several times, and the last time or two he did make some significant complaints about the caricature ads, the jib-jab ads, whatever you call them, about the dancing puppets. Those ads sponsored, I guess, in part or principally by two individuals in Oklahoma City, and he named them. We don't need to, but I know you have some personal knowledge about that. What caused those ads to be put together?
Well, let me give the details of it, because first of all, two individuals anywhere in America have no ability to give money to an organization that's specifically targeted towards a state. It's wrong. It didn't happen. And I think Congressman Carson was making some assumptions that he didn't really have all the facts on. And I think he was just sort of angry about the involvement that these individuals were having with an organization that supports Republicans. And this is America, and that right exists. I would say with those ads, and with the interest of full disclosure, Kent, as I was telling you beforehand, I did do those ads. I mean, those were ads that I helped to create. And I think what the goal of those ads were, the Dancing Brad ads, were this campaign had gotten so negative that I think it was about time that people who were watching TV and being so inundated with these advertisements got the opportunity to laugh. But still at the same time learn something. And I think that was the goal of those ads, and I don't know whether we accomplished that or not. I'd like to think that we did, but I'll tell you, they made me laugh, and that was my first goal. So
the Carson campaign responded to the negativity by Brad announcing that he was no longer going to go on the attack. And the Coburn campaign responded by coming up with a humorous, but stayed negative.
Well, but those ads were not in any way associated with the Coburn campaign. Those ads were paid for by the Club for Growth, an organization that I just
but the voter doesn't necessarily.
The average viewer.
I think you'd be surprised about that. We did a dial test of 19 undecided voters for the last debate.
What do you mean dial test?
Well, it's called a perception analyzer dial. All it is, Ken, is really like a television remote control where people dial up if they like something towards 100 and down if they don't like something.
So you've got a
0.
device in their home.
No, we brought 19 people together. They watched the debate together, and they dial tested it. Okay. And what I did is I actually talked to them about a lot of the issues going on, because one of the assumptions was that voters didn't understand the difference between outside groups and the campaigns. And these were 19 regular Oklahomans that just were still undecided about 10 days out from the election. And we asked them whether or not they did understand the difference, because, as you know, Congressman Carson brought up during the debate these two individuals. And it was the second lowest rating he received that entire evening. And it caused me to explore more deeply with these participants in this focus group why they had rated it so lowly. And they said, one, because they have the right to do so. Anyone has the right to get involved in a campaign. And two, because it had absolutely nothing to do with Tom Coburn's campaign. So I think there is a level of sophistication with the voter today that really a lot of political figures dismiss or don't think is there, that we've got to understand that we're not dealing with the same sort of voter in this information age where they can go to the internet and they've got a 24-hour news cycle they can learn from that maybe we were dealing with 6 to 8 years ago. And I think campaigns have to understand that and respect that, and they often don't.
Let's say Bush had not been on this ticket. Let's say that the Senate campaign happened to be at the top. Does Coburn still win?
I think he does, because again, I would argue that there is a certain ceiling in Oklahoma that exists today that a Democrat cannot get above. I will say that I told some people about 6 weeks out that I thought Carson was running the perfect campaign, and I felt like he was headed towards victory. And I was sort of challenged on that, so I went back and examined past results. And I do believe it is very difficult without a strong independent at a top of the ticket race for a Democrat to get above.
So you're saying a Democrat would be aided if there was some sort of independent that might take votes away from the right.
Exactly.
And maybe like the last governor's race with Richardson and Largent and Brad.
Exactly like that. And I don't think Sheila B. was ever that alternative to people. I mean, she gave people who were angry at both candidates an outlet, but she never got above 6% in polling, and I never believed she would get above that.
Let me ask you to focus on the U.S. Senate races as they came out. Were you surprised that the Republicans made as strong a showing and picked up as many seats as they did in the Senate?
I was. I think it was it went counterintuitive to what a lot of people thought. It showed that Republicans nationwide, and I'll tell you this, I attribute a lot of that to Bush. I think Bush ran a very good campaign, and they didn't necessarily get credit for it. Karl Rove, who hired me at the Republican Party of Texas, who ran this campaign, he is one of the smartest people I've ever worked with, and he knew what he was doing in the states that he was targeting. And you look at the U.S. Senate where Republicans picked up seats in Florida and Georgia, and they lost 2 seats, just for full disclosure, in Illinois and Colorado. In Illinois, they were really never in the game. They didn't have a candidate from the state running there, and in Colorado, it was a unique situation with the Attorney General running against Pete Coors, who owns the brewing company. I think there were some challenges there because of that. So it was a campaign where Republicans won seats they weren't supposed to win. You look at Georgia, though. Georgia is a story that hasn't been told yet. Republicans picked up 35 seats in the state house in Georgia. Unprecedented. And to see that sort of change in the South, and I would include Oklahoma as a southern state, one that maybe hasn't moved as quickly as Texas or some of the other ones, but there is such a change going in the South towards the Republican Party that you're going to see probably in the next 4 to 6 years, and this is what's reflected in these Senate elections. You bring up South Carolina, North Carolina, that it is going to be a different country, a different form of elected official that's going to be representing Americans in Congress because of this transition that is really kicking into gear. It's been going on since the Nixon Southern strategy, but it is really over the last 2 to 4 years just become, it's taken hold and it is building steam, and I think you're going to see it now moving to states where it wasn't before: Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and
growing as
Oklahoma.
fast as NASCAR.
Things just as fast, right.
Chris Wilson's our guest on The Verdict. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. Our guest this week is Chris Wilson. He's in charge of Wilson Research Strategies, a pollster, political expert, and he's explaining what happened last week during the elections.
Let's talk about the 9 state questions, not those individually, but what effect did the fact that there were 9 state questions on the ballot have on the turnout and the outcome?
I'd say none. I think it had a confusing effect on people. There are situations where, and we did tracking on a lot of these state questions, and I'll tell you, the marriage amendment was one in particular that it was really, if you were for the marriage amendment, you were against gay marriage, and if you were against it, you were for gay. It was just, there was a lot of confusion created from it, and I think people did figure it out. They got in the polling booth and read each one, and that's the beauty of Oklahomans. They take their responsibility and democracy very seriously. But I would be willing to bet if you were to go back to the million-plus people who voted, they'd say, I could have lived without having to vote on those.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that all of them passed, does that signify that there's just a level of optimism in the state in general?
I don't know that it's a level of optimism. I think what it is it's a level of once you get to voting yes on them, and there were some fluctuations back and forth, don't get me wrong, a couple of them were very close, but I think it creates momentum. You start voting yes on the lower numbered ones, and by the time you get to 13, 14, etc., it's you're just okay. And it has a lot to do with the ordering of it. I think if it starts at the first one is a popular one, and I think the veterans one was one of the first ones, and just kind of by the time you get through them all, it really causes people to just say, well, I guess these are things that we should be for.
I heard a lot in the last year about get out to vote efforts, and Hollywood had a lot of them going on. MTV was promoting get out to vote, and I was wondering all the time, is this going to have an effect on the elections? Are we registering people? Are we getting them to the polls that normally wouldn't be involved in an election, and is that going to have a difference? Turnout was high, but it didn't necessarily seem to sway to the Hollywood left, or did the evangelical right get their people out to vote?
Well, that's exactly what happened, Mick, and it's sort of interesting that you've got so many figures in Hollywood, the Michael Moores and et cetera, who believe that their opinion is so important to people that they're going to come out and vote because they make a movie or make a statement or go around and endorse a candidate. And it's not going to make it's going to have no difference whatsoever to most people, because let's face it, who are people more likely to listen to? An actor on TV or their pastor from the pulpit? And I think the activity this year by the evangelical community, and in 1992, evangelical vote was off by a couple million votes. This year, it increased by 9 million votes. And that is a very significant factor. It was a calculated factor. It was something that Karl Rove talked about at the Republican winter meeting last December or January. And it's one that was very well planned out, calculated, and it worked in a lot of these states like Ohio where it came right down to the wire, and I think it probably made the difference in the election.
I know you've spent some time looking at the Oklahoma State Senate races and the fact that the Democrats have retained control of the state Senate. What kind of impressions do you have?
Well, I think it's still up for grabs what ends up happening in the state Senate. There are a lot of conservative senators that I think are going to take a look at the current makeup and really ask themselves, who am I going to be more supportive of, or who am I more ideologically aligned with? Glenn Coffey, leader of the Republicans, or Cal Hobson, leader of the Democrats? Both are good and honorable men, but I think they are both very different ideologically. And I don't think you're done seeing the jockeying that's going to go on in the state Senate. And whether it's this year or whether it's 2 years from now, Republicans will end up taking over the state Senate. And I think it is just by some very sort of misfortunes for Republicans that they didn't take it this year. They came very close in Lawton, they came pretty close in Tulsa, and both those races were kind of lost because of friendly fire. And it's as you sort of go back and you look at the surprises from the election, I think two of those surprises are that Dooley Bartlett and Ken Easton lost whenever they probably should have won.
What kind of relationship do you expect between Todd Hyatt, who's probably going to be the new Speaker of the House on the Republican side, and Governor Henry?
Well, I think Brad Henry has said from the beginning he wanted to work in a bipartisan manner. And in fact, early on, he'd said there might be some Republicans he would campaign for. I don't know if he ultimately ever did that. But I think those sort of statements really go a long way. I know you mentioned I was executive director in Texas under President Bush, or Governor Bush at the time, and he had an excellent working relationship with the Democrats in the state House and state Senate. They were his friends. And in fact, if you remember when he announced for president in 2000, he did it from the floor of the Texas House that was still controlled by Democrats, and he was introduced, or I guess it was 99 actually, and he was introduced by one of the leaders of the Texas House that was a Democrat. And so I think there is the possibility exists for that to happen. This is a state where we're all Oklahomans. We have a lot of pride in Oklahoma. I say that not living here, but being from here. And I think that sort of pride of being Oklahomans and wanting to see a better state can help pull Brad Henry and Todd Hyatt together, and I think they can concentrate on the things they agree on. There's probably more of those than there are things they disagree on, and hopefully we can get some things passed like tort reform and tax reform and some of the things that both of them have said at times in their career that they're for, that they can now move forward on.
Well, term limits seem to help the Republicans.
No question.
Definitely in the House, and they made strides in the Senate. What happens in 2 years when the rest of the Senate term limit effects take place?
Well, that's why I said it's really not a question of if the Senate goes Democratic or Republican. It's a question of when. You have 9 seats up in the state Senate in 2006 that are term limited. Okay. All of them are held by Democrats. Of those, all but 2 are going to be competitive races that Republicans are going to take a shot at. You've got Kane, you've got Capps, you've got Fisher, you've got Harrison, Hobson, Kerr, Monson, Sheridan, and Taylor.
They're all gone.
They're all gone.
So the Democrats would have to go 8-1
to hold the Senate.
To hold the Senate. If they went 7-2 and everything else evened out.
Everything evens out.
Then it would even out. And if the Republicans can get more than 2, then it would appear that they would take the Senate.
That's exactly right.
That's if the incumbents all stayed.
And I'm thinking if I'm a Democrat state senator right now, I've got to be looking at that and making some calculated decisions, particularly for those that were just elected and may be conservative on some issues. Are they better off spending 2 years with the Democrat Party, or perhaps switching parties and becoming a Republican today, so that in 2 years when Republicans take over, that they're in a position of power and don't all of a sudden move into the minority and have no power for the next 12 years that they're in or 10 years they're in office. So I think those are important decisions that a lot of people are probably wringing their hands over right now, sitting up at the state Senate, or those people who've just been elected between now and the time they get sworn in.
Let's keep our prospective look 2 years ahead. Is Brad Henry beatable in 2 years?
Well, I hate to talk about him in terms of being beatable because he has to be able to get a lot of things accomplished for the state over the next 2 years. As you know, Kent, we put out a quarterly survey that has tracked Governor Henry's popularity, and he is a popular governor. I would argue, though, that Frank Keating, over the same course, if we'd been doing that survey back then, he would have been just as popular. The fact is, people like their elected officials, if they've got mayor as their first name or sheriff or governor as their first name, unless they do something that just really makes you angry, then you're going to support them and you're going to say that, yes, I've got a favorable opinion towards them. And I think Brad Henry has been successful in doing that, not really getting out front of anything that's been very unpopular. That said, things are going to change this year. It's the House being controlled by Republicans. Todd Hyatt's statement that the state is under new management, I think, it's at least 1/3 under new management. And you're going to see completely different dynamics. And the way that Brad Henry interacts with the Republican House, because even though this is a majority Democrat state in terms of registration, ideologically it is a Republican state. The way that he interacts with that House is going to determine whether or not he'll be reelected in 2 years.
We are out of time. Chris Wilson, thanks for coming on.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having me
Chris.
on.
Kent and I'll have a final word after this. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett, Kent Myers, a final word.
Without reflecting any more on who won or why, I think all of us can be buoyed by the fact that more new people were registered to vote and did in fact vote than in prior elections, and that's good for the democracy. But let's get away from elections for next week. We're bringing back an old favorite, Joe Castiglione, who will be back to talk to you about some new and different things we haven't heard before about what's going on in college athletics.
And we like to give information where you can find out more information on today's guests. And the web information for Wilson Research Strategies would come at w-r-s.com. Thanks to Chris Wilson for coming on the show. We'll see you next week.